Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Gupta and we are here in the week 3 of our course, that is Threads of Visual Exploration, Textiles and Allied Practices Part 2. And in this week we will be talking about dye and modern painting. So in this week we will be mostly focusing on the technique of painting. However, as we have already mentioned that we cannot really make a clear distinction between painting and printing, and we will come to more on that. However, let's look into some of the things that we will be focusing on in this week. So we will look into the introduction to the history of dye and modern painting in southern and western India. So these are two regions in India today that we find that this the dye and modern painting has been done. Now when we also look into some of the similarities and dissimilarities between painting and printing, we will probably be able to more sort of understand that this how I'm understanding this idea of modern painting, and then how that will probably be different from understanding the printing activities. So this is one of the aspects we'll be looking at in terms of the introduction to history of dye and modern painting. However, we will be not just going by all the historical aspects or just to do an overview, but we will look into some of the boundaries which were perhaps created in this kind of textiles and to understand them perhaps in a different perspective. The other thing we will also have as part of this week is the demonstration of dye and modern painting following kalamkari techniques. Now, I must also make it clear that this is done by external dye expert Mr. Ajit Kumar Das and his family, and in this case what we will also see that in this dye demonstration, even though we are closely following the kalamkari techniques, but in this case for the sake of demonstration we have refrained from using a kalam which is usually incorporated in the making of kalamkari in southern India and in the Deccan. So we have sort of used a brush for the demonstration, but apart from that most of the processes would remain similar. Now let's look into what we are talking about in terms of understanding the introduction to the history of dye and modern painting. Now of course that we see that dye and modern painting is something, it is very similar to the way we understand its history, that how from the beginning of the history there are textual records, or there are sort of records of patterns on the sculptures, the body of the sculptures, on the depiction of fabric, which might have sort of proclaimed that there were printed fabrics and painted fabrics. So the history of the printed fabrics, perhaps we have more of printed fabrics from 8th to 12th centuries, but then not really too many of the painted fabrics, those we have today. So the painted fabrics, perhaps we will see them from the 16th to 17th centuries and not before that, and the ones those are surviving today are mostly from the Coromandel region of southeastern India. Now what we see there, that when we sort of see the painted and the printed fabrics, how do we differentiate them? That probably becomes a major issue when we understand this kind of fabrics through the technique and through the processes of making. So for both painting and printing, we see a set of tools are incorporated, which is not the case in terms of yarn and fabric dyeing, as we have mentioned in the beginning of week 1. And so in this case what we see in both in painting and printing, templates as stencils are used for tracing images, or if there are requirements for repeated images on same textile or different textiles. So the templates are extensively incorporated, and we have also seen this thing that how the templates might have also been used not only for repeating one image from another, but then also in terms of how knowledge is transferred from one medium to another, for example from mural to textiles and so on, or textiles to mural, vice versa. So this kind of issues we always see when we kind of understand the use of templates and stencils, and both of them are there in painting and printing. Now then again, then how do we understand them, that I mean how painting and printing are sort of there? So one of the other issue that also comes up a lot when we understand painted and printed fabrics, that the aspect of repetition, that in the printed fabrics we find how a block or a wooden block is used for repetitive motifs. But the thing is that I mean we cannot deny the fact that even in painting there are repetition of images. So this is not really a viable way of understanding how painting and printing can be differentiated. So in both cases we find that tools for references, or like I mean for example the tools for or like I mean the associated objects which are used for making stencils, for templates, those are used. And then also, even if not a strict or perhaps like I mean an identical representation or an identical replication of one image to another that happens in printing, but then we do see that I mean there is some level of repetition that also takes place when these are hand-drawn images. So the only difference we can perhaps think about in these terms is that there are different sets of tools which are used for making painted images as opposed to the making the printed images. So the making of the painted images, we do see that there are certain kind of tools which are used, which usually are called column. But then also for making the printed images, the engraving tools for making the wood blocks are also called column. So again, there is by looking at all those things, we can actually see that there are more similarities between painted and printed fabrics than the differences. However, we will look into some of the aspects of the details of production, and that might also explain that I mean why these tools, even though being very similar, they are also distinct from one another, and that is the reason they need to be considered differently. Now what we also see here is that I mean there are also some of the issues which usually comes up in the history of sort of like I mean making this painted and modern painted textiles, and that is the perhaps like I mean in what context those are produced, and if one kind of image making predates the other or not. And that also comes up in the understanding of painted and printed images, since printing is something that is associated with a repetitive process which is much more prominently seen, and which is perhaps maybe like I mean maybe that can also be closely associated with a number of other printing technologies which are prevalent today in our societies. For those reasons, a lot of times we have the misconception perhaps that the painted images might have predated the printed images, but which is most definitely not the way in which the artisanal production works. And in both cases, as I have mentioned, that stencils and templates are extensively used, and for those reasons we cannot really claim that one thing was not really in use when the other was prominent. So with those things, let us look into little more of what we can glean out of this this painting practices. Now when I say painting and the dye and modern painting, so that I mean by that I mean that usually what we see in this kind of processes, that the outlines are first drawn and then mordant is either drawn with the same kind of column or with a different kind of column which is little more thick, and then the feeling of the areas would also be done. So the image that we have on screen in the right side, and this is perhaps half of a canopy or a wrapping cloth, because this is a detail of this textile. We will see a larger version of this textile later in this presentation, and this is perhaps between 15th to 17th century. It was made in the Deccan or in the Coromandel region, and it was meant for the Indonesian market, for the Southeast Asian market. And in this case, what we see that, of course, that the outlines of the images were sort of clearly drawn, and then the red areas are the ones which are Mordant painted. And then in addition to like the regular painting of the outlines or the contour lines, and then the feeling of the areas for modern painting, we also see that there is a use of resist, and the resist dyeing is used for the areas which are marked in blue. So both the pale blue and the slightly darker blue, so those are the areas which are dyed in indigo resist. So in those cases we definitely can understand that, I mean, those areas were covered in wax and made those into those patterns, and the areas which were not covered in wax, the entire fabric, when it was dipped in the indigo vat, so those areas, the areas which are not covered with wax, would have received indigo dye from there, and repeated dyeing would ensure a darker or a deeper shade of indigo that is also reflected in some of the areas, for example here and here. So these are some of the things we can find that how this modern painting technique is incorporated for making textiles. Now, a little more into the history of this modern painting techniques, that in terms of geographical locations of this painting traditions, we find that at least 3 regions, or perhaps 2 regions, we can understand that, I mean, how they have specialized in this kind of modern painting. And one would be in Gujarat, in the Ahmedabad area, and by the river Sabarmati. And there we find the practice of making matani pacheri is something that is done in this way of modern and dye painting. And in this tradition we find that a very simple bamboo column or a tool is used for making the images. So in the right side of the screen we have a representation of a contemporary artisan who's making this matani pacheri in Gujarat and near Ahmedabad. And here we find that this bamboo tool or a bamboo brush, whatever it is called, the way you call it, it is used for sort of feeling the color, or like, I mean, feeling the mordant in this area. So this is not really the sharp area that is with the sharp tip which is used for doing the outlines, but this is the area which is used for doing the filling. So the opposite end of it we can find here. This has the sharp tip which would be used for doing the outlines here. So first the outlines are drawn, and then this alum solution mixed with tamarind seed powder or gum arabic is used for this mordant solution. So the mordant is painted on the fabric, the areas what is desired to be red, and then this is, of course, this is washed and dried and then boiled in the dye solution, which today is predominantly alizarin and not madder. Now, as opposed to that, if we see that, I mean, matani pacheri is one of the practices that is there in Western India, and perhaps one of the few practices that we have today that sort of utilizes mordant and dye painting. In the southern India, in the eastern coast, the Coromandel coast of southern India, we see that, I mean, for a long time, for centuries, this tradition of mordant and dye painting with resist painting has flourished, and part of this practice is still prominent in part of this area. So one area would be in part of in southern Andhra Pradesh, that is around this area, that is Srikalahasti, and here we find the tradition of kalamkari dye and modern painting for making temple hangings. And then we also have the practice of making kalamkari hangings and paintings in the area which is very close to the ancient city of Tanjavur, and that is Karapur, or this area called Sikalnaikanpet, and that is by the river Kaveri. And here we also have this kalamkari making tradition. So this is perhaps much lesser known and not really widely practiced as compared to the one that we have in Srikalahasti by the bank of river Swarnamukhi. So here what we see that there are certain kind of differences between tools as well. So if we understand that in the Western India we have this very simple bamboo tool, which is kind of like in one edge of the tool is sharpened and made into this fine tip for dipping it into this iron and jaggery solution and used for making the outlines, the ones we see here in the image on the right side of the screen. And then like the same tool, the other end of the same tool is kind of like made into this slightly thicker brush, which is used for filling the areas for modern painting. So if these are the kind of like variations we see in one tool, and that is used by the Wagri communities in Gujarat, then in southern India, in both Srikalahasti and then also in Sikalnaikanpet or Karapur, we find that there are very sophisticated columns which are used for doing this work. So the column which is already been introduced in the earlier part of this course, we can see that there are also bamboo made columns, but then there is this bulbous grip which is dipped in the dye solution and it kind of holds the dye. So once one like slowly presses the bulbous grip, and the dye solution sort of drips through the tip of this column, and then the images can be drawn effortlessly. So this is something we find that is used for making the outlines. Then for feeling, we find slightly thicker of these columns and with the same kind of mechanism, but then that is used for doing the feeling much more easily than using a very fine tipped column. Now for resist painting, we also have column that has also been spoken about, and in that case we have a metallic tip attached to this bamboo holder. So that is also, even though that looks very similar to the columns which are used for dye and modern painting, however its mechanism and the material that is used in making this this column is slightly different, because instead of like in the bulbous grip of the bamboo column, in which we find that usually cotton and thread are used for making this bulbous grip, and for this wax resist column, which is hardly in use today, it utilized human hair. Now these are some of the differences we find, that how this, even though the final product, the final outcome might look very similar in terms of the Matani Pacheri and then Kalamkaris, in both we see the prominence of the fine line drawings and the areas which are covered with mordant and then red dyes and so on. But then the tools which are used for making them are drastically different. In southern India, we find much more sophistication has gone into making these tools, and that's the reason we see that different tools are used for different kind of purposes, and that also adds to the complexity of the images which are produced in this case. So apart from this, these two areas that we spoke about in southern India, that is Srikalahasti, and the area near Tanjavur, that is Karapur, but we also are aware of the other sites such as Pudukottai in Tamil Nadu, which is not that far from Tanjavur, which was known for wax resist painting, and so and also perhaps some form of discharge painting. So those kind of activities we also see, and those also incorporated different kind of iron and metallic tools for doing this images. So these are some of the aspects we find, that how the mordant and dye painting, even though we see that the final outcome might look very similar from between them, but then there are different kind of techniques and different kind of community histories, perhaps those are involved with making these objects. Now let us go back to this issue about which came first, and whether a question like that is actually relevant. So a lot of times when we look into the this modern painting and Mordant and dye painting of Sri Kalahasti, and then its relationship to the other side of kalamkari making that is very prominent today, and that is Machilipatnam area, and where we find that there are more of perhaps entirely of this printed textile making tradition today. So there is little bit of painting or use of stencil for making textiles in the Machilipatnam area, but predominantly it is printed textile making. Now the thing is that, I mean, the question kind of comes that a lot of time this question is asked, that whether the temple hangings which we prominently find in the Sri Kalahasti region, the temple hangings, and when we say temple hangings, we should probably not just restrict it to the Hindu temples, but we also find a large group of church hangings as well. So perhaps we can think about the religious hangings. So religious hangings which are used in ritualistic purposes. So what came first, like the religious ritualistic hangings or the wearables? Now it's for its relationship to religion, and since like in South Asia a lot of craft practices, a lot of artisanal practices are always linked to religion, then the usually the kind of assumption that comes here is that, I mean, perhaps the religious practice predates the more sort of like, I mean, the practice that is associated with trade activities and exchanges. However, we perhaps have to think about this division a little more carefully. And the thing is that, I mean, there is not really any material record that suggests that one thing predates the other. Actually, what happens is that we find the textiles which were traded from one region to another, like for example the one we have seen here, this predates the hangings that we actually hold today in the museum collections. So if this kind of textile we see them, those are dated from 15th to 17th century, the hangings that we have today are not really before 17th century, and the religious hangings mostly we have from 18th century onward. So what happened in this case, that, I mean, why do we have to think about whether there are simultaneous developments or there are something else? So let us look into perhaps some of the aspects of this textile making, and that might make us also think about whether there's a simultaneous development or not. So let us start with the visual that we have on screen here. So this is a rectangular piece, and this closely follows the Armenian Gospels, and this is primarily made for Armenian church, as the museum, Victoria and Albert Museum, where this hanging is stored today, has sort of indicated. And in this case, what is there, we see a prominent border, and there's this that also sort of frames the composition that is there at the center. At the center stage, we see this very prominent figure of Jesus Christ who's crucified, and then there are also the associated other biblical figures we have around him. Then there are also angelic figures, we see them flying around him. There are also the representation of sun and moon. So those ways we have like the entire the iconography of the Christ being established. And then we also have certain areas in this image, for example this area and this areas, which are very clearly patches of printed textile which are added here, perhaps at a later time when these areas were either torn or destroyed in certain ways. So in this piece, what we see here is that how the figuration is something, and then the use of color and everything else is we find them to be very closely associated with the other hangings which were produced in this region. This kind of the lines of the figures to suggest a sort of a lyrical contour of the body, and not really very angular shape of this body, and then either the 3/4 profile face or perhaps a profile face. So those kind of like strategies which are incorporated in making the figures, which we find also in the Hindu temple hangings, something that is incorporated here as well. And as I have mentioned that the theme is very closely linked to the Armenian gospel, and then this is a very contextual piece which is meant for an Armenian church. For those reasons, we see a really interesting amalgamation of certain kind of visual styles which is prominent in this region, but also at the same time the iconographical details and the information which is specific to Armenian gospels. If we look into perhaps some of the motifs and then its interrelation, we see that this perhaps in this case, that the elements in this church hanging, for example the battlement that we have here, and the battlement is used here for as a framing device of this entire image, and it is a architectural component which is seen in the Sultanate architecture of Deccan India. So for example, in the Qutub Shahi architecture, we see this kind of battlement very prominently in the Golconda Fort complex, or also in the Adil Shahi architecture in Bijapur and other places. So this battlement, which are very it's prominently architectural components that we see them there, is profusely incorporated in textile making. So the battlement we see here is also there in this tent hanging, which also comes from which comes from 17th century. So in the upper register of this image we see the battlement, and it's very similar to the way the battlements are actually arranged on the top of the architecture, either at the top of the walls or the top of the roof. We find this kind of battlement structures are there. So this is something which is very contextual, and when this gets transferred to a hanging like this, we see that the use of battlement is again there for not really just for ornamentation, but it also marks the edges of this painting. So the way in which the architecture the battlements are utilized for making or marking the edges of the structure is very similar here. We find that how the framing is sort of utilizes this image of the battlement. So with those things we can understand that how the juxtaposition of the religious hangings and then the tent hangings like the one we have in the right side of the screen are something that is not really a valid, the differentiation between these two are not really a valid one, and there are more juxtapositions in terms of that how the artisans understood that what image goes where, and then incorporate them with the demands of the patrons. So this is something we find that the knowledge circulation between the artisans about the architectural elements, iconography and the demands of the patrons are something those were simultaneously kind of incorporated and worked with for making them into this very curious and interesting mix of images. This kind of overlaps or this kind of juxtapositions also make us question about this idea of what is ritualistic and what is perhaps not. So the ones like the tent hangings, for example, here we have that would have much more sort of a utilitarian value than the one that is here in the left side. But then when we look into the way in which the artisans have incorporated certain kind of images, and it is not just using them as ornamental images for space filling, but then a very contextual use for marking the edges. In both cases it shows that perhaps in the artisanal communities this very strict boundary of the utilitarian and ritualistic textiles or objects were not as prominent as the way we see them today in the scholarship. So these are some of the ways in which we can continue to discuss about the use of mordant and dye painting, and we will look into some of the other aspects of them in the next lecture. Thank you.